I want to cover party systems. I will briefly talk about different dimensions of party systems and types of party systems, and then spend the bulk of the time on distinguishing different party families to conclude with a discussion of the major parties in a few select countries. The dimension of party systems that are of interest to us are mainly two, which is really just how many parties there are and how big they are relative to each other. The number of parties varies quite a bit across countries. If you think about the US, there really are only two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, while in Western Europe, in many countries or in most countries, there are a lot more parties that are relevant in the political process and that have seats in the parliament. I would say on average, your typical Western European democracy has about 6 or so parties in parliament. And that does raise the question why it is that the number of parties varies across countries. One answer to this question is called Duverger's law, after a French political scientist, Duverger, who points out that the electoral system is absolutely decisive in shaping the number of parties in a country. In particular, he says that majoritarian electoral systems, the first past the post system that you know from the US, favors two-party systems, while PR, proportional representation, leads to multi-party systems. That's the content of the law. So the electoral system determines the number of parties that you will end up with. In particular, majoritarian electoral systems lead to two-party systems. Why is that? What explains Duverger's law? There is a mechanical effect and a psychological effect. So the mechanical effect of Duverger's law is that there is a high threshold in plurality electoral systems, or in the winner-take-all systems, or in the majoritarian electoral systems. So it's simply not possible to represent it if you're not getting a lot of vote shares. In the US, in the extreme, you need to only one party wins a seat. So everybody that is below, that is a smaller party, simply will not be represented in the system. And there's a psychological effect on the demand side and the supply side. It gives, on the demand side, voters to strategically vote. So even if, let's say, you're in favor of a third-party candidate during a presidential election, you know that it's not going to be the case that, say, Ralph Nader is going to be winning the presidential election. So you have really only a choice between whoever the Democratic candidate is and whoever the Republican candidate is. And so one consideration that you might have in this situation is that you do not vote for your true first preference, but that you vote strategically for whoever you like second best, or which of the two true choices or plausible choices or plausible winners you prefer. And then that's whom you vote for. And on the supply side, there's a very similar mechanism going on. So by supply side, I mean the party side. It simply doesn't make a whole lot of sense for third parties or minor parties to run candidates, because there is virtually no chance for them to winning an election or a seat. And so that gives parties incentives to either merge with each other to form bigger parties, or to simply not field a candidate. There's different types of party systems given the number of parties and their relative size to each other. We distinguish 4 different types. One would be dominant party systems in Sweden between 1932 and the 70s, and after that as well is a good example. So Sweden was very much dominated by the Social Democratic Party, which won most elections in between those or during these decades, and always formed the government. You have two-party systems. The UK would be a good Western European example, the United States another one. And in two-party systems, as the name suggests, there's two main big parties, and they share about all of the votes, or 80% of the votes. They typically alternate in power, and typically the government is formed by one party. And so in the UK, for example, it is the case that typically either the Social Democrats win the majority of seats in the House, or the Conservatives do, and those majorities are such that they can elect the Prime Minister with more than 50%. Multi-party systems are very typical for Europe, and Switzerland would be one example. Here you have simply several parties, none of which is hegemonic, and you get a range of different coalition governments. There's a mixture of 2 and 3, which are bipolar systems, which represents some Western European country for some time periods and decades after World War II. Germany would be an example, but this is slowly going away everywhere. And what happens in these systems is that you have parties that are generally considered to be left parties, typically Social Democratic and Green parties, and you have parties that are considered right parties, Christian Democratic parties, radical right-wing parties, perhaps liberal parties, and people select parties, but then governments are typically formed by either left or right parties together. That's been the case in Germany for many decades, until that system in a way broke down, and you had a series of grand coalitions between the two biggest parties. I now want to discuss different types of parties in Western Europe. And in order to do this, I need to somehow classify each national party into a type of party. And that's often very easy. For example, in many European countries, you have parties that are green parties, and they call themselves green parties, and they are in favor of ecologism and have other typical green party positions. And so, as someone studying these cases, these countries, you know the party, and you see the party, and you know it's a green party. But it's not always as clear-cut. And so, to make this more systematic, scholars have approached this problem from 3 different directions, which fortunately yield all pretty much similar or comparable groupings. The first approach is a genetic approach, which looks at the shared origin of parties. You look at when they historically emerged, what kind of grievances they formulated, which type of interests they represented, what kind of voters they had. And a second approach is a behavioral approach, which is easy to apply in the European Union. So in the European Union, you have European elections for the European Parliament, and in the European Parliament, you have national parties represented, and these national parties are seated next, not by country, but by party type. So each party of each country has to declare to which party group they belong. And so the Green Party would say, we are belonging to the Green Party, and the Social Democratic Party would say, we're belonging to the Social Democratic Party. And so that will allow you to very clearly infer how the party classify itself. This is typically uncontroversial. There are some cases where this leads to some confusion and conflict on the right, where you have new often radical right-wing parties that enter the European Parliament. They're often anti-European as well. And they say, oh, we are a conservative party, and then the conservative party family representing the other conservative parties say, no, you're not. And so there's these debates about some borderline cases, but generally it's fairly straightforward. And then there's a third approach, where scholars look at what parties promise and what kinds of programs they suggest in their manifestos or electoral programs. And the argument these scholars make is that really it matters what parties say. If a party that calls itself a Green Party but doesn't talk about the environment, then it hardly would make sense to label it a Green Party. Now the good thing is, no matter these approaches, you tend to end up with very similar groupings, and I will discuss 9 party families in Europe. In particular, there are 4 families of the left and 5 families of the right, or center and right, and then a few other parties that are less important. So the 4 families of the left are the Social Democrats, which is the most important of these, the Communists, the New Left, and Green parties. The big story here is that the Social Democrats are the biggest party historically. It's typically the most important party on the left. But their influence and vote shares tends to go down in recent decades. Green parties, on the other hand, have emerged in the 70s and 80s and have steadily increased their vote shares over time in many European countries. The five families of the center and right are Christian Democrats, conservatives, liberals, agrarian or center parties, as well as the far right. The big story here is threefold. First, Christian Democrats and conservatives tend to be substitutes. So either a country in Europe has a Christian Democratic Party or it has a conservative party, a significant conservative party. It typically doesn't have both. The second story is that Christian Democratic parties or conservative parties, depending on the country, tended to be the biggest country of the right, but their influence has been waning. And the third big story is that just like Green parties on the left, there is a new family of parties in town, and that's far-right parties or radical right-wing parties that have emerged in the, say, last 2 decades or so, and are now a fairly regular appearance in most Western European party systems. There are other parties, ethnic parties, regional and single-issue parties, but I'll only brief them in passing because they're not particularly common. Ideologies had a pretty direct impact on the formation and shape of party families in Western Europe. We can group the main 3 ideologies, socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, on a one-dimensional policy space from left to right, with socialism being most left, conservatism being most right, and liberalism being somewhere in the middle. We could also add communism as an ideology on the very left, and nationalism or fascism, its extreme form, fascism, on the very right, and that would give us this alignment of ideologies from most left to most right, where left and right are very broad ideological terms. If we do this, we see a pretty clear mapping of ideologies into parties and party systems. So communism fueled communist parties, and socialism fuels social democratic parties. Liberalism is the ideology of liberal parties. Conservatism is the ideology of conservative or Christian democratic parties. And nationalism or fascism is the ideology on which radical right-wing parties rely upon. New left parties and green parties are somewhere in between socialism and liberalism. It's a little more difficult to place them in a one-dimensional space. Social democratic parties are the big party on the left in Western Europe. Social democratic parties are one of the oldest political forces, having been established in the late 19th century as a reaction to the dire situation that workers faced due to the developments of the Industrial Revolution. They are arguably still the single most important party group in contemporary politics, even though their influence and their electoral size has been continuously declining. They are representing workers, historically speaking, and as we see industrial shifts from manufacturing to the service sector, that has faced a big challenge for social democratic parties as their natural constituency has shrunk, and in order to stay electorally competitive and win elections or participate in government, social democrats needed to reach out to new constituencies. And so they are trying to put together a rather fragile electoral coalition and are becoming less central in politics, even though they're still very important. They captured around 1/3 of the electorate, yet that is declining. And in some countries they got more than 50% of votes, But the 1/3 is less than what the established elites feared, because if you think about it, there's a lot more workers than there is non-workers in industrializing countries. And so the elites, the incumbents, were afraid of social democratic parties because they thought they would win all elections, but that did not happen. What also did not happen is that is a social democratic party in the US. So the US does not have a social democratic party. There's a good book about this called Why It Didn't Happen Here, and the "it" in the title is the Social Democratic Party. The platform is fairly closely derived from socialism, the ideology of socialism. Historically, social democratic parties were anti-capitalist, had fairly radical Marxist programs. Over time, there has been a shift between, a split between social democratic parties, or between left parties, into social democratic parties and communist parties. And the social democratic parties have embraced capitalism. They do not want to abolish private property. They do want to tame capitalism. So they are in favor of welfare states. They have fairly egalitarian values. And important in Europe, they're also in support of European integration. One classic question in the scholarship on parties is, what's left for the left? Which refers to the problem that left or social democratic parties are facing a fundamental problem. And that problem is structural change. All rich democracies underwent a process of deindustrialization, where the economy changes from being primarily about manufacturing to one that's primarily about the service sector. And that in the industrialization process changes the relative size of different groups or classes or types of workers in society. And in particular, it leads to a decline in the size of blue-collar workers, which are the traditional constituency of social democratic parties. Now, as they face smaller constituencies, social democratic parties have been trying to reach out to new constituencies, and they often found what one could call sociocultural professionals as an attractive electoral to pursue. But these often highly educated, often high-income people working in education and other professional jobs have quite different interests and preferences and attitudes compared to their blue-collar worker colleagues. And so that makes it difficult for social democratic parties to put together a viable coalition that would allow them to win elections. And so that dilemma, or that problem that the left faces, has led to a decline in the general power of social democratic parties in terms of size of the electoral pie and participation in government. Here you can see the vote share of social democratic parties in select Western European countries, such as the UK, Austria, Germany, Sweden, and others, as well as the overall average across all rich democracies. So that would be this line here, the gray patterned line that's declining. And as you can see, on average, social democratic parties had about 1/3 of the overall electoral pie, so they would win 30% of the seats in parliament typically on average. But in some countries, they did much better. So in some countries, they came close to the 50% mark and had majorities, single-party majorities, for example, in Austria. But that's been going down quite rapidly. In other countries, they've never been particularly strong. Having that said, social democratic parties are the main parties on the left in Western European countries. Social democratic parties are one of two types of left parties, the other one being communist parties. And communist parties, in many ways, are the original left parties as they were founded in the 19th century, and they did not reform. So the split in the left led to communist left parties and social democratic left parties. And communist left parties did not embrace capitalism. They want to abolish private property. They are seeking a revolutionary road to socialism. They're often anti-system parties. They're often pro-Soviet parties with the Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution. So they're also completely unimportant in contemporary Western Europe, and they have never been particularly important. There are very few countries where they gained significant vote shares, Italy and France being the main exceptions, but even in those countries, they did not participate in government and they were not influential in policy making. After 1989, with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they are essentially gone. Here you can see once again a select group of countries and the vote share of communist parties in each decade since the 1960s. And as you can see, overall here this gray patterned line is not only very low, it's also going down. So the trend has been clearly one of disappearance of communist parties or of decline. The two countries where they were significant at some point are essentially France and Italy. So this is Italy here and this is France here. But even in those countries, they were never particularly important electorally speaking. Another party family on the left that is often distinguished is the so-called New Left, which has not been important in terms of the size of the party or government participation or influence on policymaking. It is a broad political movement that emerges in the 60s and 70s and is closely associated with demand for civil rights, gay rights, abortion, equalization of gender roles, freer drug use, so legalization of marijuana, and has not really directly to do with Marxism and the class struggle and the labor movement, and is in a sense a different type of left that in some countries furthered the growth of green parties, which have been established and are important, unlike new left parties. So in many ways, they are left libertarian parties that have been primarily successful in Scandinavia, but even there at a very low level. The party family on the left that is growing is composed of green parties. These are ecological parties that emerged in the 1960s, 70s, and then started to enter parliaments in the 1980s, and ever since have increased their vote share significantly, and to the degree that today green parties are serious, predictable parties in many Western European parliaments that sometimes enter coalition governments and actually do govern. They have many similarities in terms of their welfarism to social democratic parties. They share the idea that social justice is a high. Here you see the Green Party's vote shares in select Western European countries as well as the average. And as you can see here, they started out at nothing, and then starting in the 70s and 80s they entered parliaments, and by now on average they have about 5% of the seats in parliaments in rich democracies. That average would be higher if we take out countries that simply don't have green parties in parliament, such as the US. But in other countries, they clear the 10% thresholds and are serious parties that are the third biggest party, sometimes the fourth biggest party, and that become interesting coalition partners for typically other left parties. So a typical coalition in Western Europe would be one between a Social Democratic Party and a Green Party, and those have governed together in some countries in the last few decades. Turning to the families of the center and of the right, I will discuss 5 party families: Christian Democrats and conservatives, with the phenomenon being that typically a Western European country has either one or the other, but not both. Then liberal parties, which you find everywhere, and then agrarian parties, which really aren't important, and then the emerging parties of the far right. Christian democratic parties come in 3 types: Catholic parties, confessional or mixed Catholic and Protestant parties, and Protestant parties. And this split mirrors the split of Europe into a Protestant north, a Catholic south, and a mixed middle, which goes back all the way to the Reformation. The Catholic parties you find in Austria, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland. The Protestant parties you find in Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the confessional or mixed parties you'll find in Germany and the Netherlands. They have, in the countries in which they existed, polled around 1/4 of the electorate on average. In some cases, a lot more, but they have declined in importance and vote shares everywhere. Their platform is a mix of conservatism and religion. So they are conservative on moral issue. Historically, they have been anti-abortion, anti-divorce, anti-gay rights, anti-stem cell research, though in the last decade or 2, they've, in many cases, become a lot more mainstream on these issues and would embrace pro-choice today. They would embrace gay marriage in some cases. So they did change. They are also fairly similar when it comes to social policy positions, similar to Social Democratic Party. So they are pro-welfare state in many cases. And the reason they are is not only is there a strong impetus from religion to care for the worse off, but also given that they are what holds these parties together is the religion. Their constituency isn't so clearly sorted by income as in other cases. So they're not representing workers or they're not representing employers. They're representing Catholics or religious people. And they can come from all sorts of walks of life with homogeneous, with non-homogeneous preferences on welfare states. And so countries in which Christian democratic parties were important since World War II or even before that are countries that have fairly big welfare states. And a good example of this would be the German case. In terms of the vote share of religious parties, what you see here is that in some countries they've been important. That would be primarily Austria and Germany. Italy was dominated by a Catholic party until the party system collapsed in the 1990s. But on average, across all countries, their share of the electoral pie has been relatively modest, and it has been declining, as you can see here with this line. It has been declining almost everywhere, and so these very big 50% of the electoral pie, Christian democratic parties are a phenomenon of the past. As a rule of thumb, if you don't have a Christian democratic party in a Western European country, you'll have a conservative party, which is in some aspects similar. In terms of their platform, however, they are more conservative and more market liberal than Christian democratic parties, so they're less supportive of welfare states. They are more pro-private enterprise. They are more law and order oriented. They embrace traditional national values. They are the biggest party on the right in several Western European countries, including the UK and France, as well as Spain. They also have not been huge, so on average they get around 15% across all rich democracies. And as mentioned, you either have a Christian Democratic Party or you have a Conservative Party. Very rarely do you find both. Here you see vote shares of Conservative parties with high vote shares throughout in France as well as the UK. On average, they are somewhere between 15 and 20% in all rich democracies. The party that would be counted here in the US is the Republican Party. Liberal parties you'll find everywhere in Europe. They are market liberal parties, so when I say liberal and talk about Western Europe, I mean market liberal, unlike the usage in the US. They have always had about 10% of the electorate, though in some countries they've been significantly stronger than that, with Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland as good examples. They have been very often in governments, and one reason for that is that they're very convenient coalition partners both for the left, so for social democratic parties, and for the right, which are conservative or Christian democratic parties. And the reason is that they're basically somewhere in the middle of these sort of ideologies. If you sort ideologies, we said you would put socialism on the left, you would put liberalism in the middle, and you would put conservatism on the right, or most people would do that. And so liberals, which are relying on liberalism as the main ideology, focusing on individual rights, on minimal or less state intervention, and on libertarian values in terms of moral issues. So liberals are somewhere in between. And so they can be pretty pragmatic in both working with social democratic parties as well as with conservative or Christian democratic parties. And they have done this. So here, as you see, they've been on average more than 10% in rich democracies, though clearly in some countries they are unimportant, such as France, and in other countries they're more important. But size is really not the issue here. If you look at the German figure, so in Germany they've been hovering around like 10%, 5 to 10% or so. But they've been in government a lot, like almost all of the time. So even though they're small-ish parties, they're very important parties in many Western European countries. We can skip over agrarian or center parties because they really are a very Scandinavian phenomenon. They don't exist in many countries. Historically, they have represented agrarian interests. Now, as most economies are not agrarian anymore, or well, none of them in Western Europe is, they have been renamed in center parties. They sometimes have made coalitions with social democratic parties. These are called red-green coalitions. But really, they are such a Scandinavian phenomenon that we will simply skip over them. Here you see, well, agrarian parties, or the agrarian party is important in Sweden and only in Sweden, or almost only in Sweden. Far-right parties are a fairly recent phenomenon, and they are the growing party on the right. Remember, on the left, the biggest parties on the left were social democratic parties, and they are declining almost everywhere. And what is increasing on the left are green parties. On the right, the big party on the right is Christian democratic or conservative, typically in Western European countries, and they, in most cases, have been declining. And the growing party family on the right is the far right. The far right has different names. It's sometimes called radical right. And those are the nicest descriptions thereof. There are many examples. The FPÖ in Austria, this used to be a market liberal party and became a far-right party under Haider. The National Front or Front National in France with Le Pen, the father, and then the daughter. The Northern League in Italy, the Flemish Bloc in Belgium, the Progress parties both in Denmark and Norway, and I could go on and on and on. They are becoming a very typical phenomenon. They have not been in government in important ways, so they've been mainly in the opposition, and the few times they participated in government, things became complicated and they often then massively lost in the follow-up elections. Their platforms are more closely tied to nationalism than any of the other parties, and in some extremer versions they're plain anti-immigrant, plain xenophobic, plain anti-Islam. Many are very nationalistic and anti-EU. So these sort of nationalistic sentiments with a concentration on the nation and a call for restricting immigration and to close borders is very typical for far-right parties. Now, what they often do embrace are social policies, or general social policies, as long as they go to natives. So they are welfare chauvinist parties, as we would say. And in many ways, the mix of nationalism and welfare state, pro-welfare state positions has been a potent formula for these parties and have made them attractive for quite a wide range of potential electorates. As a result, they have gained vote shares, and significantly so. So if you look at Austria, for example, the FPÖ, which many people would now today classify as a radical right party, even though it used to be a liberal party, won like north of 20% of the electorate and did participate in governments, surely at the local level. They've been important in Italy, France, they're important, and so on average they've been increasing, as you see here with this dashed gray line, to about 10%. One country where they've not been successful at the national level is Germany, and that is for historical reasons, where because of the horrors of fascism and nationalism in the interwar period and then World War II, there's a pretty clear taboo for parties to embrace such values, and the incumbent parties are trying very hard to not allow any party that is further to the right of them to enter the political competition. Now, that is eroding, however, and so it's not very difficult to predict that far-right parties will remain an important voice and will become an increasingly important voice in electoral politics in Western Europe. Not all parties neatly fit into the 9-party family scheme that I discussed, and so we call them other parties, and they include ethnic, regional, and single-issue parties. Ethnic parties exist in some countries that have ethnic minorities, and one example of this would be the Basque parties in Spain, representing the northern region that is trying to achieve independence. Another example would be the Swedish party in Finland, representing Swedes living in Finland. There are regional parties which are very similar to ethnic parties, except that the bond is not ethnicity but region, but these overlap very closely. And then there's single issue parties that come and go, essentially. So you will find in some countries, in Switzerland, the automobile party trying to make it easier to get around in a car in Switzerland. And then they would win 5% of the vote share, or 10% even in one election, and then they would be gone. A recent example is the Pirate Party in Sweden, which is a party that wants free downloads and no protection of content, of digital content and things like this. Many countries have small pensioner parties, or grey panthers as they're often called. Some have animal rights parties. So you can see they represent very, very small causes, or concentrate on very specific issues. And that inherently is difficult for parties to do, at least if they are growing, because assume you have an animal rights party winning an election and forming a government. The only thing that would unite its constituency is the desire to protect animal rights, but that doesn't tell you anything about what they should do in terms of the budget, whether they support welfare states, whether they want the EU to become more integrated or less so, whether they should intervene in military conflicts, how they should reform or change the pension system, or any of these other big issues that are routinely coming up in politics of rich countries. As mentioned, ideologies and parties or party families have a close link. Very briefly, to recap, socialism is the ideology for social democratic parties, liberalism for liberal parties, and conservatism for conservative or Christian democratic parties, to put it very, very simply. If you add communism on the very left and nationalism or even fascism on the very right, that completes the picture of the main party families that you find in Western Europe. As a little application exercise, I want you to think about what is the major party on the left in select Western European countries, and what is the major party of the right in these countries, and what might be other important countries. So for example, in the US, the major party of the left are the Democrats, and the major party of the right are the Republicans, and there really is no other important party in this system. Now, how does this look in other European countries, in the UK and France, Germany and Sweden in particular? Well, it's easy to do this on the left, because the major party of the left is invariably a social democratic party in these cases, and in Western Europe more generally. It gets a little more complicated on the right, because the major party on the right is either a conservative party or a Christian democratic party, and so you ought to know which it is. In these cases here, it's Germany that has a Christian democratic party as the main party of the right, and the UK, France, and Sweden have conservative parties. Other important parties, well, here it gets more diverse. In many European countries, Western European countries, you have green parties. In many you have liberal parties. In many you have the increasing importance of radical right-wing parties. One way in which one might fill in this table is the following. In the UK, the major party of the left is Labour, which is a social democratic party. The major party on the right are the Tories, which is a conservative party, and the third most important party are the Liberal Democrats. In France, you have the Parti Socialiste, Parti Socialiste. On the left, despite its name, that is a social democratic party. On the right, you have what is called the Republicans. It's the same party that has been renamed in various forms in the last few years. So it changes its name fairly often. It's a conservative party. And other important parties include the National Front, which is Front National, which is a radical right party. Germany, Social Democrats on the left. Christian Democrats on the right, and then other parties are liberals, the Greens, and a new left version. Sweden, once again, the big party on the left is the Social Democratic Party, called the Social Democratic Party, the SAP. The moderate party is a conservative party on the right, and other parties exist in the country, including the Sweden Democrats. The United States is fairly exceptional when it comes to party systems compared to Western European countries for several reasons. First, unlike in your mainstream Western European party, you only have two parties, not like 5 or 6 or even more, as is typical in most parliaments in Europe. What's also special is that these parties really both come from liberalism as an ideology, and so both the Democrats and the Republicans, at least historically, share this commonality in terms of basic principles, in terms of how the market should be tamed or should not be tamed, and things like this. There is no Social Democratic Party in the United States. Now, this has changed, especially since Reagan, when the Conservative Party or the Republican Party became more fused with some conservative elements, making it the home of Christian voters today. Now, one interesting, or I believe interesting, thought experiment is the following. Imagine the US had a multi-party system with, say, around 5 parties. If you think about European party systems and how they look like, how do you think the United States would look like if it had more than 2 parties? So if the United States had an electoral system which would lead to more parties in parliament, how would they look like? And there's many fun answers one could give here. I'll not take sides. I'll simply present something that The Economist put out in 2016. So The Economist argued that if the United States had a parliament with more than 2 parties, these would be the parties. This was published during the primaries both in the Democratic and the Republican parties in the 2016 presidential election. So on the left, you had this clear split between Bernie Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters, so in the Democratic primary. And The Economist says that Bernie Sanders' positions are pretty much social democratic positions, like the positions that social democrats in Europe typically embrace. They would be protectionism, big government, and socially liberal positions. Although, to be fair, many social democrats in Europe are actually not very protectionist, because many of these Western European countries are really small and heavily depend on trade with other countries. Now, Hillary Clinton's party, The Economist calls the Liberal Party, and classifies as a center-left party. This is in many ways a quintessential liberal party, pro-trade, pro-immigration, and socially liberal. And that has been the criticism of the Bernie Sanders supporters of Hillary Clinton and the mainstream Democratic party establishment, that they are not a left party, but that they are a center party. Now, on the right, things got more complicated with a very divided nomination process for what then became Donald Trump's nomination and then the presidency, with John Kasich from Ohio being the Conservative Party representative, if it was its own party, which is pro-trade and socially conservative. Then the Christian Coalition, with Ted Cruz being a typical member of this hypothetical party, which is a right party, which is also pro-trade, which is also socially conservative, but has more religious influence than the Conservative Party. And then the People's Party, which The Economist says is the Donald Trump strategy, which they say is a populist platform with nativist, protectionist, but potentially socially liberal elements to it. Now, I'm not sure whether this is how a party system would look like in the United States. In particular, given that in Western Europe you either have a conservative or a Christian Democratic Party, it is unlikely that the Conservative Party and the Christian Coalition, as the economists call it, would coexist, but who knows. Other parties that might exist in the United States if it had more parties could be an ethnic party. Clearly, African Americans vote very, very disproportionately for the Democratic Party, and there would be no reason to believe that there would not be a party that is essentially an African American party. You could also think about the emergence of national or regional parties. In particular, California is a big state, a populous state, which is in many ways quite different from the rest. So is Texas on the other side, and one could think of a scenario in which Texans would vote for parties that want Texan independence or something like this, and then they would be represented in Congress. But these are all just thought experiments, and you should take them with a huge grain of salt.